Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity of having a conversation with you today about agriculture, climate change, and indeed the future that we can all look forward to. Agriculture and the actions that will take place in agriculture over the next number of weeks, months, years, and even decades will impact directly the kind of world that we will live in into the future, not just for ourselves, of course, but for our children and for their children and beyond. So now is a key moment in time in terms of the action that we're going to take. And in that context, it's probably useful to just consider where we're starting from. So the good news is that Ireland has a very high level of ambition in terms of greenhouse gas emission reductions between now and 2030. At a 51% reduction, we would be on track to meet the Paris goals, and indeed we would be one of the highest levels of ambition of any country in the world. That's the good news. We also have put in place a structure around how we're going to achieve that in terms of establishing 2 5-year budgets for this decade and a provisional one for the first half of the next decade, by establishing during the summer this year the sectoral targets for each of the sectors, although land use is yet to follow, and to start the process of annual climate action plans that will set out the policies and the measures that we will use to achieve our goals. All of that is very positive, and indeed it's a very good start. But I think we do have to pause for a moment and consider our starting point and understand the difficulty of the challenge that we are facing. So for this carbon budget exercise and this emission reductions that we're talking about, we have taken 2018 as our base year. And the agricultural sector in that year represented 34% of our emissions. Indeed, if I was to add to that the share coming from land use and land use change, that is an additional 11%. So combined, agriculture and land use, what we will call in the future the AFLU sector, represents 45% of our emissions here in Ireland. So it's clear that this is a really steep challenge that we have before us in terms of taking the measures and the actions necessary to reduce our emissions. But let's look at agriculture first. In agriculture, of course, the main emissions that we are looking at are nitrous oxide and methane. At 34% of emissions in 2018, that was about 23 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent. The sector has a target of reducing that by 25%, which means a reduction of somewhere between 5 and 6 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent in the next 10 years. Hopefully front-ended, of course, because we need the actions to take impactful effect as quickly as possible. So what are the issues that are facing agriculture in the short term? Well, the measures that are being looked at, of course, are looking firstly at nitrous oxide, and that's, of course, in the area of fertilizer use. As you've seen from a lot of the media and the studies that have been done, including some of the food vision groups that have been set up by the minister, you can see that the targeted reduction of fertilizer use in Ireland is about a reduction of 25%. But not just a reduction of 25%, it's also a shift in use away from fertilizers such as CAN into protected urea. And remember that protected urea has a 5-fold saving of greenhouse gas emissions. So a very important shift in terms of the practice of fertilizer use in the country. Combining these two will deliver almost half of the 25% reduction that we're looking for in this decade. And the important part of this is that it makes commercial sense for farmers to do this. It makes sense, for example, because firstly, we all know that nitrous oxide is a potent greenhouse gas emitter. Fertilizers cost money, and in the current environment, we are aware of supply chain difficulties. So that's a challenge for farmers. We're also looking at a very substantial increase in costs of fertilizer. So the question is, can we reduce our fertilizer use without adversely affecting our farming practice? And the answer, of course, to that is yes. Combine that with the absolute necessity of looking at our runoffs into our rivers and our lakes and our streams, which, as you know, has been a problem over the last number of years. So combining the improvements there foreseen, for example, under the Nitrates Directive, means that we can benefit not only in terms of the climate, but also in terms of the water, the atmosphere, the air that we breathe, but also ultimately farmers' pockets. For example, protected urea, certainly up until now, has been no more expensive. So it's actually a cheaper option with a much better impact on the climate than non-protected urea. So the key issue that we're looking at here is to look at the balance of costs and rewards for farmers for the practice that they use at the moment. Yes, commodity prices are high, but input costs are high and increasing at a faster rate. So preserving the margin, the income for farmers, is a key issue. And this is an area where the two objectives of income protection and ultimately climate change can work together for the benefit of all actors concerned. So our number one priority in this context is looking at the nitrous oxide through the fertilizer use and reducing it. Challenge, of course, is awareness raising and deployment, rolling it out across all farmers across the country as quickly as possible, achievable in a short time, because of course, in this context, you're talking about an annual cycle of farming. And to do that in the short term brings really positive results, both for farmers, as I say, and for the climate. Accompanying that, of course, are farming practices that will be modernized and introduced and rolled out as well. Things like low emission slurry spreading, mixed sward planting, liming our land, for example, to improve both the performance of the land, the quality of the product that's coming from the land, and also to reduce our emissions. So those farming practices, we've been talking about them for quite a bit of time now. These also will assist in terms of reducing the nitrous oxide. And as we all know, nitrous oxide is a particularly potent greenhouse gas as such, with a multiplying factor of 28 times CO2 itself. So big area there, a big challenge for us to look at that and to get that one right. All of the economics, all of the research, the science points to that as an important solution, an opportunity that exists, and one that we need to move on as quickly as possible. Of course, we also have to think about the other greenhouse gas emission coming out of agriculture, which is, of course, methane. Clearly, in the area of methane, we are looking at best, the status quo vis-a-vis emission reduction. The emissions we had in 2018, they're still there in 2019, in 2020, in 2021, and they're likely to be there in 2022. We have a real challenge in this context. Our cattle herd in this country is undergoing a shift. We can see that from the numbers coming from the CSO. When we look at the beef cow numbers, they are in a gradual decline, they are being adjusted, but the numbers in the dairy herd are continuing to increase. And as we know, dairy cows emit more per capita than beef cows. And that means that our emission profile from our cattle is continuing to stay high in an unadjusted way. So our real challenge is to try and move that forward in a way that allows the emissions to start being reduced. Clearly, the more we do in the first part on nitrous oxide, the easier it will be in the methane side. But we cannot avoid changes in the methane area. And in this context, of course, we're looking at genetics, at improving the profile of production of our animals to improve the outputs, the efficiency of their operation. We're also looking at, for example, the age of slaughter for some of the beef herd and moving that one forward. And we're looking at, and this is perhaps the most important area, additional income sources for farmers who choose perhaps to diversify into new areas. And the kinds of areas that we're looking at would include, for example, things like organic farming. And it's not just organic farming of plants, although obviously plants, and particularly plant protein, is a key opportunity and a key market growth internationally. So it is an opportunity for farmers to go into that space. but also organic farming of animals. As we move forward, the market will start to shift and demand and pay a premium for organic beef, organic dairy products. And that's an opportunity for our farmers to move into as soon as possible. Another area, of course, is in the whole forestry space. And I'll come to that in a moment as to the issues that we have facing us in our land use section. And of course, a third area for additional income sources for farmers comes in the area of energy. We've seen it very prevalently at the moment with the Ukraine war, with the consequential impact on gas prices, the threat to security of supply, certainly the cost increases, both for gas and electricity, the concerns that we have with the prices of diesel and petrol and home heating oil. It puts into perspective the importance of energy within our society. And this is an additional income stream available for farmers to produce energy in the form of biomass, for example, in the form of solar power, in the form of wind power. So these additional opportunities for income generation for farming are very important. They're important for society, but they're also important for the farming community because they represent a real opportunity for diversification of their commercial operations. And of course, we cannot forget the opportunities that are available to us from research and development. And in that context, we rely on Teagasc for the new innovations that are coming down the track, the new opportunities that will present themselves, the new products indeed that we can use, including methane reduction inhibitors that are currently being developed. Are they applicable in the Irish context? If so, how best can it be done? Clearly, this is urgent research that we need to do and we need to make available to farmers as soon as it has been validated. So out of that, you can see that we have a very real challenge in reducing emissions in the agricultural sector, 5 to 6 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent. It's not going to be easy, but it is achievable. We actually have the technologies and the pathways available to us today. The challenge that we have is awareness raising, knowledge transfer, support for farmers, and then implementation at the farm level across all of the country. I mentioned that I would come back to the issue of forestry because, of course, it's also a very important area. And in this context, Ireland is a significant outlier vis-a-vis the rest of Europe. By the way, we are also in agriculture because in Ireland, we have a lot more cattle than we have people, and we don't have as much heavy industry as, for example, other countries in Europe have. But in the forestry area, we're also an outlier in that our land is actually a source of emissions. In most countries in Europe, the land is a sink. It absorbs emissions, mainly because of their forest cover. In Ireland, I suppose the good news is, in 1900, 1% of our land was covered by trees. Today, it's closer to 11. But over the last 20 years, the plantation rate has really fallen off a cliff. And it means that we are now seriously exposed with our land becoming a source of emissions instead of being a sink. And this is something that we really need to reverse. Key issues in this context, obviously, are peatlands, a major source of emissions at the moment, and re-wetting the bogs is a serious challenge. It's one that we can do and we will do as soon as possible. It will contribute to removing those emissions. A second one is developing our forests and rolling out our forest structure in a managed way across the country. In that context, the most recent emission from the government in terms of, was it 1.3 billion euros funding to support this whole process, as well as adjustments of the structure of that support, is very important. The idea of moving for funding from 15 years to 20 years makes a lot of sense and gives investors and farmers much greater support over the lifetime of the development of the forest. Equally, the rollout of supports, even for small stands at 1 hectare with reduced licensing requirements, very important in terms of starting the process of getting forestry accepted, getting the notion of forestry as understood as part and parcel of farming. And indeed, that's arguably one of the biggest problems that we have, in that attitudinally, unfortunately, forestry is not really considered to be farming. In other countries, it's not only just farming, it's intrinsic to the community. I visited a forest stand in Finland with the family that owned it, and the grandparents were there, the father and mother were there, the kids were there. They all went to clean out the forest stand, take away the thinnings, and then they had a big picnic. And they do this twice a year. And it's part and parcel of their culture to see the forest as an integral part of their community. Equally, the forest is a supplier of support and biomass into their district heating system, which keeps them warm in the winter. So the integrated nature of forest into the community and into society is part and parcel of the way they operate. And it's an opportunity, I believe, for Ireland to start looking at how forests can be used as an integral part and a support for society and communities locally. And that's before we even get to the stage of looking how it can support other parts of our economy. We currently have a housing shortage. We are in a situation where in Ireland, on average, we have 24% of our houses that are timber framed. In Scotland, for example, that number is 75%. And as you know, you'll build a timber frame house for less and faster if you use the proper methodology. So the opportunity really exists in a commercial sense to use our forests for our own social needs, construction, obviously district heating systems as we roll them out across society and communities in Ireland, and biomass in the energy space. Without damaging the main trunk of the tree, we can support a biomass industry, be it used for heating or indeed potentially also for transport. Going forward, it's absolutely essential that we make progress in this area, and over the next number of years, that we can move from a situation where our land is a source of emissions to at least being neutral, balanced, and perhaps over time ultimately becomes a sink. We wonder what it's going to be like to be net neutral. The reality is that we will still have emissions in 2050, 2070, beyond. It's normal. We will have, the land itself will continue to breathe and will emit. And ultimately, we have to have sources and sinks that will absorb those emissions in, for example, our forest. So the role that the forest plays in terms of our longer term stability and societal balance is hugely important. So I think from this you can see that as we look at agriculture and the practices in agriculture, the opportunity exists for really good, commercially hard-nosed, common sense decisions on investment, reduced investment indeed, on fertilizer use, moving into sustainably producing the products that we produce out of our land and maximizing the quality and the value of those in our home market and indeed in our export markets. Accompanying that then, we need to have the balance of the forests, which will act as a sink and a balancing to whatever emissions remains as we go forward into a net neutral zero zone. In that context, I hope you can see agriculture is key. It's fundamental to our success. The support of farmers and the rural community is integral to the achievement of our ambitions. And I look forward, as indeed do my colleagues in the Council, to continuing to work with the agricultural sector and to working with farmers, their partners, their wives, their families and communities in terms of delivering the best results that leads to the kind of society and community that we all want to have into the future. Thank you very much indeed for your attention.